So we come to the fifth of our clips that we are producing on discipleship from Bourne Baptist Church. In the last session, we looked at the great invitation that Jesus makes in Matthew 11, verses 25 to 30, when he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now we come to Matthew 16, verses 13 to 27, and the great confession. This confession is originally made by Peter and comes in the context of a series of stories that Matthew is telling about Jesus and his interaction with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. At the beginning of chapter 16, these religious leaders ask for a sign, and Jesus responds that it is a wicked and adulterous generation that asks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. Jesus is referring to his death and resurrection, referring to the 3 days for Jonah in the belly of the fish, and Jesus 3 days in the ground. In verse 4 of chapter 16, Jesus leaves the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they travel across the lake, which is probably the Sea of Galilee. Then Jesus takes the opportunity of the fact that the disciples have forgotten to bring bread to talk about the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Clearly, he's not referring to yeast as an ingredient of bread, as he says in verse 12. In the Old Testament, yeast is referred to as something that spreads and has an effect upon the whole, like yeast through a loaf of bread. It can refer to the effect of sin, but also can mean, as in this case, the bad teaching. Jesus is telling the disciples to be aware of the bad influence of the religious leaders in both their teaching and example. At the Passover in Exodus 12, the Israelites were told to clear out all the yeast from the house. This refers to a new start in the Exodus. Then in verse 13, Jesus in the region of Caesarea Philippi, not to be confused with Philippi in Macedonia, is in the very north of Israel, near the Syrian border, an extremely mixed Jewish and Gentile area. This is where the confession is made by Peter. Now, I believe that where this incident took place, but the fact that Matthew explicitly locates the incident in this area is significant. The confession by a disciple is not done in the center of religious comfort, but where mission is taking place. We confess Jesus, not in the place of religious comfort, i.e. the context of believers, but in the world, where that confession will not be accepted or acceptable. So Jesus asks in verse 13, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" The answer is what I have called the Great Confession. It is something that all disciples need to do, to confess the title, or rather the titles, of Jesus. Let's read this passage. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and then he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever wants to lose their life for my sake will find it. For what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." Now there are 4 titles mentioned here in this passage. In verse 13, Jesus asks, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" Then Peter responds in verse 16 with 2 more titles: the Christ, that's the Messiah, the Son of the living God. The final title is implied in verse 21 when Jesus explains to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hand of the elders, and this is the suffering servant. So we have 4 titles: Son of Man, Messiah, Son of God, and suffering servant. So the great confession is to confess Jesus, the identity of Jesus, and his role. Let's look through these 4 titles and see what the meaning of them are. Son of Man is clearly rooted in the passage from Daniel. One like a son of man approaches the Ancient of Days in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. He receives authority, glory, and sovereign power for the nations to worship him and for him to establish his dominion and everlasting kingdom. This is the heavenly Son of Man. And Jesus takes this title and applies it to himself in Matthew. In Matthew 9:6, Jesus says that he is the Son of Man, but this Son of Man has authority on earth. In the story of the healing of the man with paralysis, Jesus tells the religious leaders that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Get up and walk. More importantly, however, is the Great Commission. Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Matthew 28, verse 18. The authority of Jesus Christ emerges in the Great Confession as the disciples confess Jesus as Son of Man. We confess Jesus Christ as the one who has authority to rule and to disciple the nations. This authority means that we can disciple people who do not know Jesus. This is not simply an instruction in Matthew 28. Authority is given to his disciples to make disciples of all the nations. The second of the titles in this passage is found in Matthew 16:16, that Jesus is the Christ. Christ is not Jesus' surname, but his title, meaning Messiah. In Hebrew, Messiah means the one who has been anointed. And in the Old Testament, the people who are anointed are prophets, priests, and the king. Prophets are those who speak God's words with authority, as with Elisha in 1 Kings 19:16. The priests were those who mediate between God and humanity. They present offerings to God from the people, as in Leviticus 1:7. And then they teach the people the law, as in Deuteronomy 31:9-13. So the priests mediate between God and humanity. And obviously the king is the one who rules. Again, this refers to his authority. So to confess Jesus Christ as Messiah is to confess him who brings God's word as a prophet, mediates between God and humanity as a priest, and who rules as a king. The third title given by Peter in verse 16 is the Son of the living God. Now we must be careful to differentiate between what we understand theologically as God the Son, and as the second person of the Trinity, and the Son of God, which is a title rooted in the Old Testament. This title is originally given to Israel in Deuteronomy 8 verse 5. Jesus quotes this passage at the beginning of his ministry, in the context of Jesus as Son of God. In his baptism, Luke 3:33, in the genealogy in Luke 3:38, and in the temptation in Luke 4 verse 9, in the words of the devil. Jesus is the perfect Israelite. He is the one sent Israel itself. So to confess Jesus as Son of God is to confess him as the perfect Israelite, the one who demonstrates to the world who God is. We profess Jesus Christ as the Son of the living God we commit ourselves to living as people who will, as Jesus did, demonstrate God to the nations. This is, of course, means we're obedient to him, which we'll come back to talk about this on the session on teaching. The final title is the one that is implied, that he is the suffering servant. This is very difficult for the disciples to understand, and Peter, as representative of all the other disciples, rebukes Jesus with some very hard words to say to him. He says that he's becoming a temptation to him, a stumbling block, in Matthew 16:23. The word Satan, again, is not a name, but a title. It means the opposer. So when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," he's saying, don't oppose me. You're becoming a stumbling block. You're thinking about what people think about, not what God thinks about. People who follow Jesus have a difficult task, and verse 24 to 28 show the application. We must take up our cross, deny ourselves, lose our life. In verse 27, Jesus refers back to the Son of Man analogy, because he's going to come in glory to those who have followed him as suffering servant. So in conclusion, making the great confession is to confess Jesus as Son of Man, as Messiah, as Son of God, and as suffering servant. And that what that implies we have to work out in our own contexts. Now, I hope this has been helpful to you. And the next time we'll be looking at the issue of obeying the great commandment to love God and to love our neighbour. For now, goodbye.